Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of the military recruitment office, her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The glass door reflected her small frame back at her, and, for a moment, doubt crept in like fog rolling over the ocean. At 5 feet 4 inches tall and, weighing barely 120 pounds, she looked nothing like the powerful soldier she had admired in movies and documentaries. But Sarah had never been one to let appearances define her limits. Growing up in a small town in Texas, Sarah had always been different from the other girls her age. While her classmates played with dolls and dreamed of becoming princesses, Sarah was outside climbing trees, building forts, and challenging the neighborhood boys to races she almost always won. Her mother, Maria, often worried about her daughter's tomboyish ways, gently suggesting that maybe Sarah should try ballet or art classes instead of always getting her clothes dirty and coming home with scraped knees. But Sarah's father, Roberto, a former army mechanic, saw something special in his daughter's fierce determination. He watched as she never backed down from a challenge, never complained when things got tough, and always pushed herself to be better than she was yesterday. When Sarah was 10 years old, Roberto had taken her to a military airshow, and that day changed everything for her. Standing on the hot tarmac, watching the Blue Angels streak across the sky in perfect formation, Sarah felt something awaken inside her soul. But it wasn't the pilots who captured her imagination most. It was the Navy SEALs who gave a demonstration that afternoon. She watched in complete amazement as these elite warriors moved with precision, strength, and an unbreakable spirit that seemed to radiate from their very being. That day, a dream was born in Sarah's heart that would drive her for the next 8 years. The path to that recruitment office had not been easy. Throughout high school, Sarah dedicated herself to physical fitness with an intensity that worried her parents and amazed her teachers. While other students were at parties or hanging out at the mall, Sarah was running miles along the dusty country roads, doing push-ups until her arms shook, and swimming laps in the community pool until the lifeguard had to tell her it was time to leave. Her high school guidance counselor, Mrs. Thompson, had tried multiple times to redirect Sarah's goals toward what she considered more realistic options for a young woman. During one particularly frustrating meeting in Sarah's senior year, Mrs. Thompson had spread college brochures across her desk and smiled kindly at Sarah. "You're such a bright girl, Sarah," Mrs. Thompson had said, her voice carrying that patronizing tone that adults often used when they thought they knew better. "Have you considered nursing? Or maybe teaching? These are wonderful careers for young women, and you'd be helping people." Sarah had sat quietly for a moment, her jaw clenched tight as she stared at the colorful brochures advertising nursing programs and education degrees. Finally, she had looked up at Mrs. Thompson with eyes that burned with quiet determination. "I want to help people too, Mrs. Thompson," Sarah had said, her voice steady despite the frustration building in her chest. "But I want to do it by serving my country as a Navy SEAL. I want to protect people who can't protect themselves, and I want to make sure that freedom isn't just a word we take for granted." Mrs. Thompson had laughed then, not meanly, but in the way adults laugh when a child says they want to become a superhero. "Oh honey, that's just not realistic. The military has its place for women, of course, but Navy SEALs? That's for the strongest, toughest men in the world. Maybe you could consider becoming a Navy nurse or working in military intelligence. Those are important jobs too." That conversation had stayed with Sarah like a splinter under her skin. Not because it discouraged her, but because it made her more determined than ever to prove that strength wasn't just about size, and that courage didn't have a gender. She had walked out of that guidance office more committed to her goal than ever before. The doubt hadn't come only from authority figures. Her own family, despite their love and support, had struggled to understand her dream. During Sunday dinners at her grandmother's house, relatives would pat Sarah's head affectionately and ask when she was going to find a nice boy to settle down with. Her cousins would giggle and whisper about how Sarah was going through a phase that she would grow out of once she discovered makeup and boys. Even her best friend since childhood, Jessica, had tried to talk her out of it. One evening, as they sat on the porch swing at Sarah's house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jessica had brought up the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "Sarah, I'm worried about you," Jessica had said, her voice soft with genuine concern. "I know you think you want this military thing, but have you really thought about what it means? You could get hurt, or worse. And, for what? To prove some kind of point? Sarah had been quiet for a long time, listening to the crickets chirping in the grass and feeling the warm evening breeze on her face. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with a conviction that came from somewhere deep in her soul. "Jess, do you remember when we were kids and Tommy Peterson was bullying little Amy Richardson at school?" Sarah had asked. Everyone just watched and whispered about how terrible it was, but nobody did anything to stop it. Nobody except you. You marched right up to Tommy, even though he was twice your size, and you told him to leave Amy alone. You didn't care that you might get in trouble or that Tommy might turn on you. You just knew it was right. Jessica had nodded, remembering the incident clearly. "That's what I want to do with my life," Sarah had continued. "I want to be the person who steps up when others can't or won't. I want to protect people like Amy, not just in our little town, but everywhere. And I believe the Navy SEALs is where I can make the biggest difference." The physical challenges of preparing for military service had been intense, but Sarah approached them with the methodical determination of someone who understood that dreams don't come true through wishing alone. She had researched every aspect of SEAL training, studying the physical requirements, the mental challenges, and the selection process. She knew that historically, no woman had ever completed SEAL training, but she also knew that didn't mean it was impossible. Every morning at 5 o'clock, Sarah would wake up while the rest of the world was still sleeping. She would pull on her running shoes and head out into the darkness, her feet pounding a steady rhythm on the pavement as she pushed her body to go faster, farther, stronger than the day before. She ran in the rain, in the heat, in the cold, because she knew that nature wouldn't pause for her comfort when she was in actual training. In her backyard, Sarah had built herself a makeshift obstacle course using materials from the local hardware store and her father's workshop. She practiced climbing ropes, crawling under barriers, and carrying heavy loads until her muscles screamed for relief. When her body wanted to quit, she would think about that 10-year-old girl who had watched the SEALs with wonder and promised herself that one day she would stand among them. Swimming had been one of Sarah's weakest areas initially, which was particularly challenging since water operations were such a crucial part of SEAL training. The community pool where she practiced didn't have the rough conditions she would face in real SEAL training, but she made do with what was available. She would swim laps until her lungs burned and her arms felt like lead weights. When the pool was closed, she would drive 2 hours to the nearest lake and practice swimming in open water, learning to deal with currents and waves and the disorientation of swimming in murky water where she couldn't see the bottom. The mental preparation had been just as important as the physical training. Sarah read every book she could find about military strategy, leadership, and the psychological aspects of elite training. She studied the stories of SEALs who had overcome incredible odds, looking for lessons she could apply to her own journey. She practiced meditation and visualization techniques, learning to control her breathing and maintain focus under stress. One of the most valuable lessons Sarah learned during her preparation came from an unexpected source. Her grandfather, Ramon, had served as a Marine in Vietnam, though he rarely talked about his experiences. One evening, as Sarah was nursing sore muscles after a particularly brutal training session, Ramon had sat down beside her on the back porch. "Mija," he had said, using the Spanish term of endearment that always made Sarah feel loved and protected, "I see you out there every day, pushing yourself so hard. It reminds me of something an old sergeant told me a long time ago." Sarah had looked at her grandfather with curiosity, eager to hear any wisdom he was willing to share about military service. "He said that the strongest soldiers aren't always the biggest or the fastest," Ramon had continued, his weathered hands folded in his lap as he stared out at the evening sky. "The strongest soldiers are the ones who never quit, no matter how hard things get. They're the ones who get knocked down and get back up, again and again, until the only choice left is to succeed." Those words had become Sarah's personal motto, repeating in her head during the hardest training sessions and the moments when doubt tried to creep in. As high school graduation approached, Sarah's plan became clear to everyone around her. She would enlist in the Navy immediately after graduation, with the goal of eventually trying out for SEAL training. The decision had sparked heated discussions at family gatherings and concerned conversations with teachers who felt she was throwing away her academic potential. Her grades had always been excellent, and she had received acceptance letters to several colleges offering full scholarships. The pressure to choose a more traditional path was constant and came from people who genuinely cared about her future. But Sarah had learned to listen to her own inner voice above all others. The night before graduation, Sarah had sat in her room surrounded by acceptance letters, scholarship offers, and brochures for college programs she had no intention of pursuing. Her mother had knocked softly on the door and entered with 2 cups of hot chocolate, the same ritual they had shared when Sarah was little and had problems she needed to work through. "I'm scared, Mija," Maria had said quietly, settling onto Sarah's bed beside her. "Not because I don't believe in you, but because I know how cruel the world can be to people who dare to be different. I've watched you fight for this dream since you were 10 years old, and I've seen how determined you are. But I'm your mother, and it's my job to worry." Sarah had taken her mother's hand, feeling the calluses from years of hard work and sacrifice to give her daughter opportunities she had never had. "Mama, I know you're scared," Sarah had said. "I'm scared too. But being scared and being wrong are 2 different things. This feels right in my soul in a way that nothing else ever has. I can't explain it better than that, but I need you to trust me." Maria had squeezed her daughter's hand and smiled through tears that she tried to hide. "I do trust you, Sarah. I've always trusted you. You've never given me a reason not to. But promise me something?" "Anything, Mama. Promise me that if you ever decide this isn't what you want anymore, you won't keep pushing just because you told everyone you would. Sometimes the bravest thing is knowing when to change course." Sarah had promised, knowing even as she said the words that her course was set and nothing would deter her from it. Graduation day had been a celebration mixed with anxiety. While her classmates threw their caps in the air and made plans for summer parties before heading off to college, Sarah was already mentally preparing for the next phase of her journey. In just 2 weeks, she would report for Navy basic training, taking the first concrete step toward a goal that had seemed impossible to everyone except her. Now, standing outside the recruitment office on this hot Tuesday morning, Sarah felt the weight of every doubt, every discouraging word, and every skeptical look she had received over the years. But she also felt the strength of every mile she had run, every push-up she had completed, and every moment she had chosen to believe in herself when others couldn't. She thought about the 10-year-old girl who had watched those Navy SEALs with stars in her eyes, making a promise to herself that she intended to keep. She thought about all the people who had told her it was impossible, not out of cruelty, but because they couldn't imagine a world where impossible things became possible. Taking a deep breath, Sarah straightened her shoulders and reached for the door handle. Today wasn't the day she would become a Navy SEAL. Today wasn't even the day she would begin SEAL training. Today was simply the day she would take the next step on a journey that had already proven to her that she was capable of far more than anyone had believed. As she stepped into the cool air-conditioned office, Sarah carried with her the hopes of that 10-year-old girl, the lessons learned from years of preparation, and an unshakable belief that sometimes the most important battles are the ones everyone tells you can't win. The recruiter, a seasoned petty officer with 20 years of service, looked up from his desk as Sarah approached. He had seen thousands of young people come through that door with dreams of military glory, and he had learned to spot the ones who would make it through the challenges ahead. Something about the way this small young woman carried herself made him pay attention in a way he hadn't expected. "Good morning," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear. "I'd like to speak with someone about enlisting in the Navy and eventually pursuing SEAL training." The recruiter's eyebrows raised slightly. He had heard this request before from young women, but usually in a more tentative way, as if they were testing the waters to see if it was even worth pursuing. This young woman spoke with the confidence of someone who had already decided and was simply there to take care of the paperwork. "Have a seat," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Let's talk about what that path looks like and whether you understand what you're signing up for." As Sarah settled into the chair, she felt a moment of calm certainty wash over her. This was right. This was her path. And, no matter what challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them with everything she had learned and everything she believed about herself. The conversation that followed would be the first of many tests, the first of many moments when she would need to prove that her dream was more than just a childish fantasy. But Sarah had spent 8 years preparing for these moments, and she was ready. The bus that carried Sarah and 43 other new recruits to Naval Station Great Lakes pulled into the training facility at 3 o'clock in the morning. The darkness outside the windows was complete, broken only by harsh floodlights that created an otherworldly atmosphere of shadows and glaring brightness. As the bus came to a stop, Sarah could feel the nervous energy radiating from the other recruits like heat from a furnace. She had spent the 8-hour bus ride mostly in silence, watching the countryside roll past and mentally preparing herself for what was about to begin. The other recruits had ranged from excited to terrified, with most falling somewhere in between. A few had tried to strike up conversations with Sarah, asking about her background and her reasons for joining the Navy. When she mentioned her goal of becoming a SEAL, the responses had been predictable. SEALs? A young man named Marcus had laughed from the seat behind her. You mean like the Navy nurses who work with the SEAL teams, right? Sarah had turned around to face him with a patient smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Marcus was tall and muscular, the kind of person who had probably been told his whole life that he looked like soldier material. His assumption that she must be confused about her own goals was so automatic that Sarah could tell he didn't even realize how condescending he sounded. No, she had replied simply. I mean Navy SEALs. The Special Operations Force. Marcus had exchanged glances with a couple of other male recruits, and Sarah had seen the look that she was beginning to recognize. It was the look that said they thought she was either delusional or attention-seeking, but either way, she would figure out her mistake soon enough. That's ambitious, Marcus had said finally, his tone suggesting that he thought ambitious was another word for impossible. I mean, no offense, but have you seen the physical requirements for that training? Those guys are like machines. Sarah had nodded thoughtfully, as if she were considering this information for the first time. You're right, she had said. It is incredibly demanding. That's why I've spent the last 8 years preparing for it. The conversation had died there, with Marcus and the others clearly deciding that Sarah was someone who would learn reality the hard way. Sarah had turned back to the window, watching the miles pass by and thinking about how many times she would need to have variations of that same conversation in the coming months. Now, as the bus doors opened with a pneumatic hiss, the moment for conversation had passed. A drill instructor stepped onto the bus, his uniform crisp despite the early hour and his voice carrying the kind of authority that cut through any lingering sleepiness among the recruits. You have 30 seconds to get off this bus and form up in 4 rows on the yellow lines, he shouted. Move, move, move. The controlled chaos that followed was Sarah's first real taste of military life. Recruits stumbled over each other in their haste to grab their bags and exit the bus, voices raised in confusion and panic as they tried to figure out where they were supposed to go and how they were supposed to stand. Sarah moved with deliberate calm, having studied videos of this exact process and visualized it dozens of times. As she took her place in formation, she noticed that she was one of only 6 women among the 44 recruits. The ratio didn't surprise her, but it did remind her that she would be closely watched from the very beginning. Any mistake she made would be seen not just as Sarah Martinez failing, but as proof that women didn't belong in combat roles. The next several hours passed in a blur of paperwork, medical examinations, uniform fittings, and administrative processing that transformed them from civilians into the lowest form of Navy life, recruits. Sarah moved through each station with focused efficiency, speaking only when spoken to and keeping her expression neutral and attentive. It was during the uniform fitting that she encountered her first direct challenge. The petty officer handling clothing distribution looked Sarah up and down with obvious skepticism when she reached the front of the line. Let me guess, he said, not bothering to hide his amusement. You're here to be a yeoman or maybe a hospital corpsman? No, petty officer, Sarah replied in the respectful tone she had practiced. I'm here to train for special operations. The petty officer's smile faltered for a moment before returning twice as strong. Special operations, he repeated slowly, as if testing the words. Well, that's interesting. Most people who want special ops can at least reach the top shelf without standing on their tiptoes. A few recruits in line behind Sarah snickered, and Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. But she had prepared for this too. She had known that her size would be the first thing people would use to question her abilities, and she had decided long ago how she would respond. Petty officer, I understand that my physical appearance doesn't match what people expect from someone pursuing special operations, she said, her voice steady and clear. But I've found that underestimation can be a significant tactical advantage. The petty officer studied her for a moment longer, then shrugged and began pulling uniforms in her size. We'll see about that, recruit, he said. We'll see about that. The first week of boot camp was designed to break down civilian habits and rebuild recruits into sailors. For most of the new arrivals, this meant learning to wake up before dawn, keep their living spaces spotlessly clean, follow orders without question, and work as a team under pressure. For Sarah, it meant doing all of those things while proving that she belonged there in the first place. The physical training started immediately, and this was where Sarah had expected to face her biggest challenges. The Navy's physical fitness standards were demanding but achievable for someone who had prepared as thoroughly as she had. However, she quickly learned that meeting the standards and earning respect were two entirely different things. During their first group run, Sarah found herself keeping pace with the faster half of the group despite her shorter stride length. She had trained specifically for this, knowing that her legs would have to work harder than those of her taller peers to maintain the same speed. Behind her, she could hear Marcus and a couple of other recruits discussing her performance in voices they clearly thought she couldn't hear. She's keeping up pretty well, one of them said, sounding surprised. For now, Marcus replied. Wait until we get to the real stuff. Running is just cardio. Let's see how she does when we start lifting heavy things or doing combat training. Sarah focused on her breathing and her form, letting their words fuel her determination rather than distract her from her performance. She had spent years preparing for exactly these kinds of comments, and she had learned to use doubt as motivation rather than discouragement. The strength training sessions revealed both Sarah's preparation and the limits of what preparation could accomplish. While she could perform all the required exercises, her absolute strength numbers were lower than those of most of the male recruits, simply due to physiological differences in muscle mass and bone density. This became a source of constant commentary from recruits and instructors alike. During a rope climbing exercise, Sarah completed the climb in the required time but was several seconds slower than the fastest male recruits. As she slid down the rope, she heard one of the drill instructors speaking to another in a voice that carried clearly across the training area. She's got heart, I'll give her that, the first instructor said. But heart doesn't make up for physics. When she's trying to drag a wounded teammate to safety, those extra seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Sarah felt those words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were meant to be cruel, but because they expressed a legitimate concern that she had been wrestling with herself. She knew she was strong for her size, but she also knew that some aspects of special operations would require absolute strength that her body might never be able to provide. That night, as she lay in her narrow bunk listening to the sounds of 43 other people sleeping in the same room, Sarah found herself facing the first real moment of doubt she had experienced since beginning this journey. The instructor's words echoed in her mind, and she began to question whether her years of preparation had been enough. It was during this period of doubt that Sarah received an unexpected source of motivation. The next morning, the recruits were introduced to Chief Petty Officer Williams, a Navy SEAL who had been brought in to speak to them about special operations opportunities in the Navy. Chief Williams was exactly what Sarah had expected a SEAL to look like, tall, powerfully built, with an air of quiet confidence that seemed to fill the room. As Chief Williams began his presentation about the various special operations roles available in the Navy, Sarah hung on every word. This was what she had been dreaming about for 8 years, and hearing about it from someone who had actually lived it made her goal feel both more real and more daunting. Special operations forces require a unique combination of physical capability, mental toughness, and tactical intelligence, Chief Williams explained to the assembled recruits. We're looking for people who can adapt to any situation, overcome any obstacle, and never quit when lives are on the line. After his formal presentation, Chief Williams opened the floor for questions. Several recruits asked about the physical requirements, the selection process, and the types of missions SEALs undertook. Finally, Sarah raised her hand. Chief, what's the most important quality you look for in someone who wants to join special operations? She asked. Chief Williams looked at her for a moment, and Sarah felt as if he were seeing something that others had missed. That's a good question, recruit, he said. A lot of people think it's about being the strongest or the fastest or the toughest. And those things matter, don't get me wrong. But the most important quality is the refusal to quit when everything in your body and mind is telling you to give up. It's the ability to find a way forward when there doesn't appear to be one. He paused for a moment, scanning the room before continuing. Some of the best special operations personnel I've worked with weren't the biggest or the strongest. They were the ones who could think clearly under pressure, who could inspire their teammates when things got desperate, and who never stopped believing that the mission could be accomplished. After the presentation, Chief Williams remained behind to speak individually with recruits who had expressed interest in special operations. When Sarah approached him, she felt nervous for the first time since arriving at boot camp. "Chief Williams, I'm interested in pursuing SEAL training," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Chief Williams nodded and pulled out a small notebook. "Tell me about your background, recruit," he said. "What makes you think you're cut out for this?" Sarah gave him a brief summary of her preparation, her motivations, and her goals. As she spoke, she watched his expression for any sign of the skepticism she had encountered from others, but Chief Williams listened with the same serious attention he had given to the male recruits who had spoken with him earlier. "How are you handling the physical challenges so far?" he asked when she finished. "I'm meeting all the standards, Chief," Sarah replied. "But I know there are areas where I'll need to work harder than others to keep up." Chief Williams smiled for the first time in their conversation. "That's an honest answer," he said. "The fact that you recognize the challenges is actually a good sign. Too many people come into this thinking they already know what it takes, and they're not prepared for how much harder it gets." He closed his notebook and looked at Sarah seriously. "Let me tell you something, recruit. I've been watching your performance since I got here yesterday, and I've been asking your instructors about you. You want to know what they told me?" Sarah nodded, bracing herself for whatever feedback was coming. "They told me you're always the first one ready for training, the last one to quit during exercises, and the most focused recruit they've seen in months. They also told me that some of the other recruits have been giving you a hard time about your goals, and that you handle it with professionalism." Sarah felt a surge of pride but kept her expression neutral. "More importantly," Chief Williams continued, "they told me that you're already starting to act like a leader. During team exercises, you're helping struggling teammates instead of just focusing on your own performance. That tells me you understand what special operations is really about." He handed her a business card with his contact information. "Keep working hard and keep focusing on being the best sailor you can be," he said. "When you're ready to apply for SEAL training, give me a call. I think you might surprise some people." As Chief Williams walked away, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose that carried her through the remaining weeks of boot camp. The challenges didn't become easier, and the skepticism from others didn't disappear, but she now had confirmation from someone who mattered that her dream wasn't completely unrealistic. The comments and doubts from fellow recruits continued throughout boot camp, but Sarah began to notice a change in how some of them approached her. During a particularly challenging obstacle course exercise, she had helped Marcus complete a rope climb that he was struggling with, talking him through the technique until he was able to finish successfully. Afterward, he had approached her with what looked like embarrassment. "Hey, Sarah," he had said, clearly uncomfortable. "I owe you an apology. I made some assumptions about you when we first got here, and I was wrong. You've been working harder than anyone else, and you deserve respect for that." Sarah had accepted his apology gracefully, recognizing that changing minds would be a gradual process and that every small victory mattered. As graduation from boot camp approached, Sarah reflected on how much she had learned and grown in such a short time. She had proven to herself and others that she could meet the Navy's initial standards, but she also understood that this was just the beginning. The real tests lay ahead, and each one would be harder than the last. On graduation day, as Sarah stood in formation wearing her dress blues and feeling the pride that came with completing this first milestone, she thought about the 10-year-old girl who had made a promise at that airshow. She was one step closer to keeping that promise, but the hardest parts of the journey were still ahead. Her parents had driven up from Texas to watch the graduation ceremony, and Sarah could see the mixture of pride and worry in their eyes as they watched their daughter take another step toward a goal that still seemed impossible to them. After the ceremony, as they shared lunch together, her father had pulled her aside for a private conversation. "I'm proud of you, Mija," Roberto had said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've always been stronger than people gave you credit for, and watching you prove it has been amazing. But I want you to promise me something." "What's that, Papa?" "Promise me that you'll remember that there's no shame in changing your mind if this path becomes too dangerous or if you decide you want something different. Your mother and I will support you no matter what." Sarah had hugged her father tightly, understanding that his concern came from love. "I promise, Papa. But I also want you to know that this still feels right. It feels like what I'm supposed to do with my life." As her parents drove away after the graduation weekend, Sarah prepared for the next phase of her journey. She had orders to report to a Navy base where she would complete specialized training before being eligible to apply for SEAL preparation programs. Each step forward brought her closer to her goal, but also increased the stakes and the pressure to prove herself. Standing on the steps of the graduation hall, watching her fellow sailors head off to their various assignments, Sarah felt the weight of the expectations she had placed on herself. She was no longer just pursuing a personal dream. She was carrying the hopes of everyone who had ever been told they weren't strong enough, big enough, or tough enough to pursue their goals. The little girl who had watched those SEALs with wonder had become a sailor, but the real test was still to come. The Naval Special Operations Preparatory School in Coronado, California, looked like paradise from the outside. Palm trees swayed in the ocean breeze, and the Pacific stretched endlessly toward the horizon in shades of blue that seemed almost artificial in their beauty. But Sarah had learned enough about military training to know that beautiful locations often hosted the most brutal challenges, and PST Prep School was designed to break people before they even reached the real SEAL training. Sarah had spent 2 years in the regular Navy before earning the opportunity to attend prep school, 2 years of proving herself on ship deployments and training exercises while maintaining her physical fitness and studying every piece of SEAL-related material she could find. During those 2 years, she had encountered every possible variation of doubt and discouragement about her goals. Her commanding officers had ranged from supportive to openly hostile about her special operations aspirations. Captain Morrison, her first commanding officer, had called her into his office 6 months into her first deployment to have what he called a reality check conversation. Petty Officer Martinez, he had begun, settling behind his desk with the air of someone delivering difficult but necessary news. "I've been reviewing your service record and your stated career goals, and I think we need to have a frank discussion about your future in the Navy." Sarah had sat at attention in the chair across from his desk, maintaining the respectful posture expected of junior enlisted personnel while internally preparing for another variation of the same conversation she had been having for years. "You're a good sailor," Captain Morrison had continued. "Your work is solid, your attitude is professional, and your peers respect you. That's why I think you're wasting your potential chasing something that frankly isn't going to happen." He had pulled out a folder containing information about various Navy career fields and spread the materials across his desk. "Have you considered intelligence work? Or perhaps military police? These are challenging, important jobs where a person with your dedication could really make a difference and advance through the ranks." Sarah had looked at the brochures and career guides, recognizing them as identical to materials she had been shown repeatedly over the years by well-meaning authority figures who thought they knew better than she did about her own capabilities and goals. "Captain, I appreciate your concern about my career development," she had replied carefully. "But special operations remains my primary goal, and I believe I have the commitment and ability to succeed in that field." Captain Morrison had leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone dealing with a subordinate who was being unreasonably stubborn. "Petty Officer Martinez, I'm going to be direct with you because I think you deserve honesty. In my 20 years of service, I have never seen a woman successfully complete special operations training. Not because women aren't capable of great things in the military, but because some jobs require specific physical capabilities that most women simply don't possess." He had gestured toward the career materials again. "These other fields would allow you to serve with distinction and retire with pride in your service. Special operations is likely to result in failure and disappointment that could affect your entire military career. Sarah had felt the familiar flash of frustration that came with being told her dreams were unrealistic, but she had also felt something else, a growing sense of confidence in her own judgment. 2 years of military service had taught her that she was capable of far more than most people assumed, and that their limitations weren't necessarily her limitations. "Captain, I understand your perspective," she had said. "But I'd like to respectfully request that I be allowed to discover my own limits rather than accept someone else's assumptions about what they might be." Captain Morrison had studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Very well, Petty Officer Martinez. I'll make sure you get the opportunity to apply for prep school when you're eligible. But when this doesn't work out the way you're hoping, I want you to remember that there are other ways to serve with honor." That conversation had been typical of the resistance Sarah faced from authority figures who genuinely believed they were protecting her from disappointment. What had been more challenging were the reactions from peers who saw her goals as either attention-seeking or a criticism of their own.